to buy into a system of values. Now we're not talking about individuals. We're talking about, he says specifically, corrupted and seduced by institutions. Now we're talking about institutional, right? Institutional domination, institutional oppression, institutional subordination, institutional corruption, right? The institution wants to produce good men. The institution wants to produce good men. And we recognize that these good men are, in a sense, in a very real sense, willfully discouraged, that they are pessimistic, that they have seen a collapse in the things that they held in the highest regard. And we'll see what the effect of that is in a little bit. So I think that should be clear. Next point underneath, same column, modern man. Nietzsche says, quote, siding with the oppressed and underprivileged. Siding with the oppressed and underprivileged, right? So when we think about oppression and underprivileged, and again, secular Humanness was right on point. If we're talking about underprivileged and oppressed, you immediately create a system of hierarchy. Here I am, and here are the oppressed and underprivileged, right? The oppressed and underprivileged is specifically used to create an emotive, conceptual affinity to those who are in a different social status, a different social class than I am, or that the masses are, right? So when he says, and this is Nietzsche, quote, siding with the oppressed and underprivileged, this is a side of the modern man, right? That the modern man here, the good man, right? This is a good man, wants to side with the oppressed and the underprivileged is a very interesting note. What's good about this, right? And this is where the critique becomes, and the way in which the terms are themselves interpreted is interesting. Is that Love 83 Forever? I don't know how she would interpret this, but to say that the modern man in a pejorative sense is weakened or is decadent because he, as mass, as a representative of the mass, subscribes to, sides with, finds some type of allegiance with the oppressed, and that is itself a sign of weakness, is definitely up for debate. It's not a point that is necessarily at this level crystal clear in Nietzsche. Some people might say, Nietzsche, I mean, are you saying that they shouldn't side with? It's up for debate. The point is, especially in my presentation, I'm not going to tell you that this is what Nietzsche said, right? What I'm going to tell you is that this point is open for discussion. It's a great point of debate. Is it really a sign of weakness? Is it a sign of the modern man that insofar as he attempts to side with the oppressed and the underprivileged, that is a form of decadence that leads to pessimism, ultimately nihilism, and so on, right? Or is it a beneficial thing? I'm not going to answer that question now. I'm just letting you know that it's a good source of debate. Let's take it a step further. So he says, and actually I do want to read this. This is note 62 again. Note 62. Note 62. He says, yeah. Last sentence of note 62, page 42 on the Friedrich Nietzsche. Last sentence of note 62. It says, sensualism in matters of the spirit. In short, it is the 18th century of Rousseau. So he evokes Rousseau, right? And the question is, well, what in Rousseau is he referring? He doesn't say it explicitly, but from everything, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm almost positive he's talking about Rousseau's conception of the general will. So Rousseau comes up with the notion, and I'm not going to get into that. But you notice it has the word will in it, right? And we know the name of this book is Will to Power, right? The name of this book. And I wouldn't go so far as to say that this book is categorically a response to Rousseau's notion of the general will. However, I'm not saying that it's not, right? The idea of a generalized will, right? The will of the people. You can see now how the language of the will of the people attempts to subsume, right? It attempts to consolidate, conflate the classes, in a sense, at a very, very superficial level, right? The idea of a generalized will, as of a collective voice, if you will, collective mass, is going to be problematic for Nietzsche, right? Because the point is, it's not so much that it has been collectivized, right? That's sort of a very superficial, I would even say misinterpretation possibly of Nietzsche's text. What's the problem for Nietzsche is the fact that my conduct as a member within society is mandated by these social norms that everyone in society is ascribing to. And it's that ascription, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but it's that ascription that becomes problematic for any individual and for a society as such, right? What we'll see later is how this is working in opposition to what Nietzsche is attempting to do, right? So the general will, and he says all this is 18th century. So the way I look at Nietzsche, to be charitable to Nietzsche, is the way that I would look at myself as a young scholar. I sort of don't really care what everybody else did before me. I pay, there's a certain amount of discretion that I keep for philosophers, but I'm a new age of philosopher, and the way I do philosophy is on the internet, right? As they say, the revolution will not be the revolution. Hey, actually, I could I'd make a cool little video. They have that saying, quick tangent, they have that saying, the revolution will not be televised. And they're right, because it's on the internet, right? So, it's a super tangent. But yeah, I see Nietzsche as Nietzsche as saying, listen, all the old school cats, right? All that old school Rousseauian stuff with this general will, look where it's gotten us, right? There's been a lot of benefit, and we'll talk about sort of the quantum of humanness in a second. But there's been a lot of problems with that. Let's keep the benefit and get rid of the problems, right? I want to do something new. I want to do something that hasn't been done before, and I want to go in, right? So this is what Nietzsche does. For me, I think it's important to recognize that it's precisely this notion that he wants to sort of wage a war against, an ideological war against. The idea of a general will becomes problematized, and Nietzsche wants to, in my regard, in my interpretation, he wants to posit something in opposition to this notion. Last point in the column of Modern Man. Modern Man is a product of Rousseau's notion of the general will. If we have an idea of a general will, and that idea of the general will is a stipulation of the way that men and women, human beings, govern themselves within a social nexus, then the idea of the general will gives meaning to the term good man, right? If I were to tell you in the beginning of the lecture series that really Nietzsche's conception of the modern man is facilitated, is understood, you're able to make sense of his idea of modern man through a notion of Rousseau's conception of the general will. And it's that notion, the notion of the general will, that attributes meaning to Nietzsche's conception of modern man. What the hell is he talking about? What does that even mean? Maybe some of you might be able to understand what I just said. But that's some heady stuff. I don't think it's that heady now, right? It should be sort of clear, right? And that's another thing, just a quick tangent. That's another thing in sort of preparing for the lectures. You can't just, you don't just jump right to the conclusion. Work your way around the conclusion so that people can follow your train of thought, right? And the train of thought is, this becomes a problem. If I have a problem with the notion of a good man, because it is a consequence, he or she is a consequence of corruption, then this corruption has to inhere within something. It inheres within a system. It inheres within the institution. What is buttressing that institution? What is the foundation of that institution? What is that institution of corruption that transforms men into quote-unquote good men based on? That institution is based on sort of this idea of a generalized will, right? And Nietzsche wants to rage against this, right? He wants to say, no, that's enough. Let's offer something different. So, in opposition then to this notion of the modern man and this notion of the good man, we have a quantum of humanness. Now, keep in mind that this obviously was not intended for publication. These are notes, and the notes themselves aren't in sequential order, chronological order. So the beautiful thing about Nietzsche is that it will never get old. As society advances, since there isn't linear connections between notes, Nietzsche's text forces me